Hello everyone, thank you for joining today's expert talk, Operationalizing Net Zero, Building a Holistic Strategy. Today's expert talk is brought to you by Arcadis, who are members of our Sustainability Delivery Group. For those of you who are not aware, the Sustainability Delivery Group is an initiative set up to emphasize the technical skills, leadership capabilities, and value proposition of the environmental and sustainability consultancy sector. We believe this sector will play, and is already playing, a defining role in reshaping the natural and built environment in ways that help tackle the challenges presented by environmental degradation, climate change, and biodiversity losses. Talks like today's demonstrate the technical excellence available to those in need of expert support. My name is Cameron Franson, Senior Analyst here at Environmental Analyst, and I'll be chairing this session. Before I introduce you to our speaker today, I'll first show you around our virtual presentation platform, which is called Livestorm. So there's a chat box at the side of your screen. Feel free to say hello to other attendees, let us know where you're joining from today, and leave any other comments that you might have. There's also a questions tab that has a box that allows you to submit questions to our speaker at any time. And so I'll go through those questions at the end of the talk, but please make sure you upvote the questions that you want to hear asked first. We always appreciate your feedback to help us shape future events, so please let us know what topics you'd be interested in for the future using the polls tab. And if you have another topic that you'd like us to cover that's not there, please let us know using the chat box. So without further ado, for today's expert talk, we are pleased to introduce Keely Herman, Global Technical Director for Net Zero Strategy at Arcadis. Over to you, Keely.
Thank you so much, Cameron. It's a joy to be here today. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on when you're dialing in from. I am the Global Technical Director of Net Zero Strategy at Arcadis, as Cameron mentioned, and so I lead a team that helps organizations achieve ambitious climate targets. And so today we're going to talk about operationalizing net zero, because achieving net zero emissions isn't just a lofty goal, it is a business imperative. But how do we actually turn this goal into actionable steps? That's what we're going to explore today. So the problem, which I think we all know well, is that climate change is a global threat, and science is telling us that we have to rapidly reduce global carbon emissions by 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so what comes with that is not just setting targets, but developing a realistic long-term action plan to achieve these ambitious targets. Research has shown that 1 in 4 companies have some sort of a plan, but only 2% of those that have a plan report on all aspects of a climate transition plan, according to CDP. Why is that? Well, first of all, there's a lot of different variables: technology, cost, what are the business trade-offs, what should the timing be, and then the organizational change that's required to implement everything. So how do you create a holistic and integrated plan? That's what we're going to cover today. Before we do that, I would like to do a quick poll to understand where all of our attendees are in their journey. So there should be a poll appearing. Yep, there it is. If you click the polls tab on the right of your screen, you should see the poll, and you can go ahead and vote. I'll just give folks a minute to do that, and we'll watch the results come in. And you can see the results live after you vote. All right, this is great. So option D was a little bit cheeky of me. Nobody has finished their net zero work, of course, but it looks like a solid 50% have made a commitment but are figuring out the action plan, with about a third having a well-defined strategy, which is fantastic. So that's all great to hear. And I think you're all in the right place. So let's get into it. I like to think of 3 key steps in creating an actionable net zero plan. And those are defining what net zero means for your organization, prioritizing decarbonization projects to create a clear achievement plan, and then developing a change management approach to implement the plan effectively. And I think where a lot of companies often get lost is that they only focus on the middle step, is what are the decarbonization actions that I need to take, when really defining first and then having a clear structure and governance is equally important. So we will talk about each of these in turn. So how do you define what net zero means to your organization? Well, you can look to a few different areas to consider what it might mean for you. What are your peers doing? What type of target do they have? What types of organizations have they committed to or subscribed to? What regulations are you facing? This is, of course, a very hot topic because we have new regulations that are coming into play this year, and also a slew of emerging regulations that are in various stages of approval at this point all over the world. And so certainly the regulations that you face might guide or direct you on what net zero means for your organization. And then finally, what are third parties doing? So Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, the UN Race to Zero, Exponential Roadmap, the list goes on, especially once you get into like sector specific net zero organizations. And those organizations all have their own kind of stance and definition of net zero that you can reference. And again, if you see what your peers are doing, you can see which of those industry groups might be the most relevant for you. And so once you have all this information at hand, then it's really looking internally about what are our impacts, what is the most important, and how can we turn our potentially negative environmental impacts into positive ones. One important thing to note here is that as you're defining net zero for your organization, you want to very carefully avoid greenwashing. Having a plan is the first step to that. So many companies have set a net zero target and then not said how they're going to achieve it. And there's a lot of pushback in the market right now on companies that have a target without a plan, and that includes lawsuits. So we're getting real. One thing I always recommend is avoiding buzzwords: natural, eco-friendly, climate friendly. They're vague, they don't have a standard definition, and they're not verifiable. So best to avoid them. If you do want to make product specific claims, there are several organizations out there that will verify your climate claims related to your product, and third-party verification is a great way to avoid greenwashing. And then finally, really just be transparent, and tell consumers, advocacy groups, governments what you're doing on this. And I think critically, not just the good things that are happening, right? Of course, you want to talk about your sustainability commitments and the decarbonization actions you've taken to date, but you don't want to use that to draw attention away from any negative environmental impacts your business may have, because again, that could be taken as greenwashing. So moving on to the prioritize phase. It's really important to kind of take these 3 steps. We'll look at these each in detail, but at a high level, measure your greenhouse gas emissions. That is the very first step always. And then you can identify and evaluate potential decarbonization projects that might work for your organization. And then it's really important to optimize your plan. And again, this is a step that I see a lot of organizations kind of skipping or glossing over. Ideally, you're identifying more projects than you need to get to your target, which means you have a choice. And there's a lot of different factors that you can take into consideration when you're making those choices. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in a minute. So we're not going to go into detail today about how to calculate your scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. There's lots of resources available out there, I'm sure, including from Environmental Analyst. So definitely take a look at those if you're new to the space. But once you have your kind of scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, you want to then identify your emissions hotspots. And so that's really where the processes, activities, or products are showing up as responsible for the majority of your emissions. We want to follow the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle here, in that, usually 20% of activities result in 80% of impacts. And so the hotspot analysis really helps you focus. And those hotspots can be different depending on the industry that you're in. So for example, in manufacturing, hotspots tend to be production products and raw materials. Consumer goods, the use of sold products, scope 3 category is huge, especially if you're talking about electronics or anything that uses energy. In the retail space, transportation and logistics can be quite significant. In the services space, Building energy use is usually the biggest hitter in scope 1 and 2, but by far the biggest emissions in this space are from the supply chain. And then finally, in financial services, that in that area, investments are typically the largest source of emissions. And so you really want to focus your resources on those hotspots to make the biggest impact possible. So once you know where you're trying to focus, then you can start brainstorming potential decarbonization projects that target your hotspots. And this is a space where I really like to involve multiple teams and functions from within the organization, especially people who are not working on climate. They are not sustainability professionals. They are the folks who are responsible for running your business, for the actual operations and supply chain and full value chain. It does take a little bit of education to get those folks up to speed and kind of explain what greenhouse gas emissions are and where they come from. But I found that a little bit of education goes a very long way, and that some of the best decarbonization ideas come from within operational teams that don't work on sustainability at all. And so it's really important to not build this plan in a vacuum and go out to the rest of your business to solicit ideas. There are some common examples of decarbonization initiatives on this slide. So, you can retrofit your buildings, upgrade equipment. Process optimization is very important in the manufacturing sector. All of those serve to reduce energy consumption. There is, of course, renewable energy adoption. And these days, there are myriad ways to go about that, from on-site to a wide variety of off-site renewable energy sourcing options. Some of which can actually reduce your risk and reduce your cost. On electrification, that's probably one of the biggest hitters in decarbonization, is simply transforming fossil fuel powered equipment or vehicles into electric powered. And this is a huge growing area, and I think a big opportunity for some providers of electric equipment as well. Next, we have supply chain engagement. This is a really, really big category, and it kind of it's a catch-all for a lot of these things, and you can do a lot of the things on this list within your supply chain. So helping your suppliers with energy and process efficiency, for example. But really collaborating actively with your suppliers is going to be key. And in this space, if you feel that you don't have sufficient leverage with your suppliers, there are lots of industry coalitions that are forming for smaller companies to band together and influence their suppliers together. Next, we have product design. If your company sells a product, then redesigning products to use either less greenhouse gas intensive materials or just less material in general. And then also for anything that uses energy, designing your product to make it as energy efficient as possible. And then I think sometimes something that we forget is also engineering your products to be able to be fixed instead of being kind of essentially single use, where if it breaks, you have to buy a new one. And that gets into the last item, which is circular economy. And so, reducing waste, reusing materials, and improving resource efficiency will all go a long way. And so what do you want to do once you have your list of here are the projects that we feel are relevant to our company? Well, you want to evaluate them on a bunch of different criteria, some of which are listed on this slide. So of course, there's the greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential. How much will it actually reduce your emissions? And then cost and savings, of course, are probably the hottest topic in this space of, what's the bottom line? How much are we going to have to spend? But then you also want to think about things like level of effort, technical feasibility, and alignment with your business goals. I was working with a client recently, and we were optimizing their emissions reduction plan. And we were looking at several different options. Of course, we looked at the least expensive option, but we also interestingly looked at what are the fewest number of projects they could do to get to their target. And what that does is it significantly reduces the burden on the organization. If you can do a smaller number of very, very large decarbonization projects, it's easier to manage internally. It wound up being quite a bit more expensive, so that's always a balance. But I do think that understanding the level of effort is a really important step that, again, a lot of companies miss. And then, of course, there's technical feasibility. I think this is most applicable to some of our emerging spaces, like the use of hydrogen fuel for vehicles or backup generators. It's extremely nascent. There are a couple of pilots happening. There's lots of governments who are investing in building hydrogen networks, but we're not quite there yet. And so what do you do with those technologies? When do you reassess? How do you decide when you should invest in something really new like that? And then finally, alignment with your business goals is, does this project align with your broader sustainability and business objectives? And anytime that you can get a project that hits more than one objective, that's just a better business case for you to get approval internally. And so all of these metrics are really going to help you prioritize initiatives that deliver the most impact with the most efficient use of resources. This is an example of a result you might get from that type of review and evaluation. So you can see here for a variety of different projects, these are mostly in the transportation space. We've got the net present value, total savings, the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, marginal abatement cost, and then a qualitative rating on several different metrics. This client that we worked with was highly concerned with operational disruption and safety because they are a transportation and logistics company. And so the safety of their people is a top priority. And something like EV fleet growth can be disruptive to operations when you have to install new infrastructure. And so this is a really great way to get a more holistic picture of the reduction opportunities that isn't just based on cost. So ideally, like I said, you've identified more projects than you need to achieve your goal. And we have a tool that helps you kind of align and prioritize those different projects. And I apologize, this is supposed to be a GIF, it's not working. But we have a tool called Net Zero Catalyst. The demo is kind of on the screen, but unfortunately not playing. But it does allow you to compare projects based on all those metrics that we just discussed, and then create multiple different scenarios so that you can visualize the different options for achieving your decarbonization goals. And we have a variety of visuals in here that really help, especially executives who may not be familiar with climate and sustainability, understand the different decisions that need to be made and the trade-offs, and allow you to really make data-driven decisions. And so speaking of leveraging digital technology, Arcadis has a variety of different tools. Net Zero Catalyst is one of them. We also have COSIS, the Cost Optimal Sustainable Investment Solution, and that is essentially an energy model that identifies and evaluates decarbonization opportunities within your real estate portfolio without an energy audit, although they can be used. So that is a really useful tool to evaluate a lot of buildings for in a very fast time frame. And then finally, we have Enterprise Decision Analytics, or EDA, which is an optimization platform that helps you decide between multiple possible futures, and it has a huge computing power and can process hundreds of thousands of rows of data in a way that would really be inefficient in something like Excel. And so thinking about what digital technology you can use to make your process more efficient and better visualize your data is very important. But having a list of projects is not enough, right? You have to implement them. And that may be quite complex depending on what your organization looks like today. And so it really requires a strong change management approach. And I like to think of change management in terms of systems, teams, and governance. And we will go into each of those right now. So systems is, again, there's lots of digital tools available. This is just a smattering of carbon-focused tools. You can also use Excel or Smartsheets. And then there's lots of different kind of capital project management tools that are out there as well. We do offer what we call a phase 0 assessment, and that is where we work with an organization to understand their needs and requirements for a software, and then help you kind of make sense of the software landscape, see what's out there, and determine what's going to best meet your needs. Software is not the only way to go here. I have lots of clients who are very successfully monitoring and managing projects using internal internal tools that already exist, even Excel. But if you think that a software would help streamline your process, it's definitely a good thing to look into. And so then engaging your people. This is really, really critical. And we've talked about it a little bit already of, getting lots of different functions involved in determining what decarbonization projects might be relevant, we also want to help every function understand that they have a role to play in achieving your decarbonization goals, whether they're HR or operations or finance. And so some example of that are, operations team might focus on process improvements and, physical project implementation that will reduce emissions. Procurement teams are going to be your go-to partner for working with your suppliers and reducing those value chain emissions. And then HR can help you integrate sustainability into employee engagement and training programs, into people's annual goals that they get compensated on, and things like that. And so to kind of organize all of these people within your organization around climate, you want a clear process for accountability via a governance structure. And one of the first things I recommend is defined roles and responsibilities. And again, that's making sure every function is clear on what role they play. And also KPIs to measure that progress. That can help with your defining of roles and responsibilities. And I really recommend breaking it down. Of course, you'll have a carbon reduction target. Maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 90%. But that type of target doesn't necessarily make sense to everyone within your company. And so we need to translate it into terms that make sense for them. And then, of course, you want to have kind of a regular cadence for internal reporting, as well as a corrective action process to keep track of anything that might be falling behind. And typically, companies already have a cadence for internal reporting of KPIs and a corrective action process. And it is far better to integrate sustainability and climate into those existing processes and adjust them if you need to, rather than building new ones. And so that's a really important thing to think about. And so just as an example, a client that we worked with last fall, we had over 160 engagement sessions with stakeholders throughout the business. And what we first wanted to understand is, how does the organization work today? What is the purpose of your function and how do you do what you do? And then we started to identify pain points. And again, this is not related to climate. This is just any kind of pain point that they have in their day-to-day job. And then we can start developing solutions that are tailored to climate. And so if we can introduce a new layer of governance that addresses pain points that we've heard about from our people, then we're going to have better buy-in because we're fixing a pain point for them. And so that's going to make them more willing to participate in our initiatives. And so from there, after having over 100 conversations, we were able to really clearly document roles and responsibilities, from real estate planning functions all the way down to an asset manager who's responsible for a single building. And we did develop those KPIs. So we developed a set of 10 KPIs that were not carbon-based. They all supported and led back to the ultimate GHG reduction target, but translating that goal into more relatable metrics was really helpful to help the teams and functions understand their role. And so a few examples of those are energy intensity. That metric is really, really helpful for asset managers and facility managers who already get a report on energy use on a monthly basis, typically, sometimes even more frequently. So energy intensity, level of electrification, so what % of your facilities are fully electrified. I think if electrification is going to be really important, then your facilities management team is going to want to keep track of that metric. And then finally, things like total megawatts of on-site solar installed. So there's lots of different ways that we can express a net zero target and lots of different components. And the more you can break that down for your teams, the better it is they'll understand it and the more able they'll be to contribute. And so then we assign KPIs to each function, and some of these KPIs are shared, which is a challenge and basically requires teams to come together on a regular basis that weren't necessarily coming together before. So again, if you can front load the conversations about what's going well and what's not going well, when you ask them, oh, hey, you're going to have to jointly track this KPI with this other team who you don't work with very often. Having already identified some of the pain points, perhaps you can introduce a solution while you are introducing this new KPI. Just to recap, everything that we want to do here is define net zero for your organization, align it with your industry regulations, stakeholder expectations, prioritize decarbonization projects to create a clear and optimized achievement framework, and then develop a change management approach that focuses on systems, teams, and governance. At Arcadis, we're committed to help organizations like yours achieve their climate goals. And whether it's through digital tools, advisory services, engineering and design, or implementation support, we are here to partner with you every step of the way. I really appreciate your time and attention. I did try to keep it brief so that we have lots of time for discussion. So I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much for that, Keely. That was really insightful. We've got a question from Ken. So Ken is an environmental health officer, and he says we place focus on net zero at the project stage. How do you account for the carbon footprint of component manufacturers when assessing progress towards net zero, particularly in terms of supply chain emissions and embedded carbon in materials?
That's a question. I like it. So, it's very complex, and especially if you are, and forgive me if I've gotten this wrong, but it sounds like you are assembling components and you buy those components from multiple different suppliers, each of whom have their own manufacturing plants and respective supply chains. And so when we're working in a complex system like that, I think one of the first things is that hotspot analysis. And so can you understand from your suppliers where the majority of the emissions are coming from, both the embodied carbon emissions as well as the scope 1 and 2 emissions of your suppliers, so the energy that they put into manufacturing that component, so that you can then focus. Because if you try and solve climate for every single component of even just one product, like a vehicle or a lawnmower or a vacuum, then you will very quickly get overwhelmed and have insufficient resources to really make any progress. And so I think really trying to focus in on what are the biggest emission sources. And one thing that can help with that, especially in the product space, is a product LCA, a life cycle assessment, which will tell you exactly where all of your emissions are coming from, as well as other environmental impacts like water, for example, and potentially even biodiversity, depending on the approach that you take. And so I think really trying to focus in on the key components. And so I'll give an example. We work with a vehicle manufacturer, and we have been helping them work through build their supply chain program based on impact. So first, we looked at an LCA of one of their kind of typical vehicles and found that steel, quite obviously, was a huge contributor to their emissions. And so that's where we started. We started with working with steel suppliers. And then interestingly, the next topic we chose was actually interiors, which isn't necessarily the biggest emissions hotspot, but it is something that really matters to their customers. And their customers were being quite loud about, what are you making this car out of? So things like, looking at alternative leather or alternative finishes that are have less embodied carbon. And so I think having a picture of how those components contribute to your greenhouse gas emissions is probably the first step. And they may have a follow-up question because I don't know if I caught the whole question.
There is a follow-up from Ken. Will that assessment lead you to make a recommendation that for the sake of the climate, we should not do it?
Not do it as in not build a product? Sorry, I don't think I understand the question. There are cases where we are faced with difficult decisions, right? Should we make more vehicles, or should we expend more resources fixing the vehicles that we have on the roads today, right? That's a big question. I think it would be great to have that conversation, except that we have consumers who are driving our businesses, right? And our businesses were designed to make things which people want to buy. And so I think there's a big challenge of sort of what should we do about climate, when part of the answer could be, well, we should not make so much disposable stuff, for example, right? We should make things that last longer. But you also have to work within the confines of the society that we are selling our finished goods to. And they have a lot of demand for new things, like new phones, for example. People love a new phone. Do they need a new phone? I don't know. So I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer to Ken's question, unfortunately, because I think it's a really hard and complex topic that doesn't have one answer.
Thank you, Keely. It does say Ken is typing in the chat. So we'll see if something else comes in. If anyone else has any questions, please do feel free to type them into the questions section. I had a question for you, Keely, just off the back of that. I'm quite interested to know, like, in terms of the biggest roadblocks that organizations are facing in this space, is it more on the side of them being better equipped to figure out what to do, or actually getting the projects done or implemented within their companies?
What I found is it's getting the projects done is by far the harder part. There is, of course, the discussion on cost, and you have to convince executives like CFOs to spend the money. But I don't think that that's actually the hardest part. I really think that getting the projects done is extremely difficult, especially the bigger the organization, the more complex. We have a lot of multinational businesses out there who have operations in, 80, 90 countries, each of which has its own sort of operational culture. And implementing a global holistic decarbonization program is incredibly complex. You have to have champions in every function of your business and in every location. And then you also have to make sure that your processes are set up to efficiently move projects through from due diligence all the way to implementation and verification of results. And what I've found is that a lot of companies are simply not organized enough around capital project implementation to really take on the level of projects that net zero is going to add to the list. And oftentimes adding net zero projects can really illuminate some of the challenges that those processes have.
Yeah, thanks, Keely. And on a similar note, like, do you find that because this is such an ongoing thing, and as you say, it's such a long process to get a lot of these big projects over the line, do you have quite a kind of enduring relationship with your clients? Like, is it spanning multiple years sometimes to try and get companies moving towards their goals, 2050 goals, or whenever they're coming?
We do, yes. And I would say that has evolved over the past several years from sort of one-off engagements into these deeper relationships where we really become a true partner. And I think Arcadis in particular has a wide variety of specialties, from engineering and design to program management, to sustainability strategy, which is what I work on. And I think we can really pull together the right combination of experts to support programs in the long term. And I really think having an implementation partner, whether that's us or someone else, is really going to accelerate decarbonization, because we can be that kind of impartial reviewer of processes and identify things that are breaking down in a way that people internally might not be able to see because they are so used to the processes that they're using. And so having that third party come in and kind of take a look at all your processes and say, I wonder if you could do this differently, can be quite helpful.
Thank you, Keely. We have another question from Emma, who's asking, what are your thoughts on offsetting and how or if this can be a valid part of a net zero plan?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. And, there's been a lot of buzz, especially last year when SBTi announced that it would accept offsets and then kind of maybe changed its mind again a little bit. I personally think that offsets, and particularly carbon removal offsets, are going to be a really important component of any net zero achievement strategy. I don't think we should over-index on them. We should not be buying offsets when there are still major carbon reduction projects to implement within your business, right? It's a balance of where do you spend your resources, and should we have this sort of annual expenditure on offsets, or should we invest that money into a project that will actually avoid your own emissions? I would say invest in reducing your own emissions first, but certainly we don't know how to reduce every emission that is occurring right now. Even if companies are wildly successful with their decarbonization plans, we're going to get to 2050 and there are going to be residual emissions. And I think that the most appropriate way to address those is through carbon removal credits. My hope is that market for carbon removals specifically continues to grow, and we continue to see, startups focusing on new technologies, NGOs continuing to be involved in community projects around forestry and agriculture, and things like that. So buying offsets today, while it might be in some cases better to spend it on decarbonization, buying them today does send an important market signal. So it's one of those questions that also does not have one answer or perhaps a clear answer, but I do personally feel that offsets are going to be an important component of any net zero strategy.
Great, thank you. We have another question come in this time from Melissa. Can you share examples of doing net zero as a consulting firm? Much of the discussion is rightly focused on manufacturing and supply chain, etc. But since we don't produce products, it's hard to know where to begin explaining to people in the company not regularly thinking about sustainability.
That is a great question, and I'll actually give you some examples from our own sustainability program here at Arcadis. So we are an engineering consulting firm. Professional services is kind of our category, and we have a whole team that leads our internal sustainability work. So I'm client facing, but I do work with that internal team and support our Arcadis's own net zero goal. And so I can share a little bit about our focus areas. And right now, especially with employees, one of the big focus areas is travel. Business travel emissions are not our largest source, but they are not insignificant. And it's also something that we have direct control over. And so there have been a couple of initiatives rolled out in the last about 18 months. One of them, which I really like and got to be part of the test group for, is that every quarter, every single employee gets an email with their carbon impact from travel from that past quarter. So it shows what are your emissions from all the flights you took, the hotels you stayed at, the rental cars you used, et cetera. And I think that awareness building is a really important first step. And then our travel provider is also able to indicate carbon levels for different types of flights that you might choose, which again, just gives you that visual indicator and the option to choose the more sort of climate friendly or the lower carbon option. And I think at first, not everyone's going to choose the low carbon option. Maybe no one chooses the low carbon option at first, but over time, as people get more and more used to seeing it and they get this quarterly report and they say, oh gosh, my travel emissions went way up last quarter. Why was that? What could I do differently next time? And so it really starts to ingrain carbon into our thought processes, which will ultimately lead to changes in behavior. Paired with that program, we also have travel reduction targets that are applied to different business units. They are a part of people's official corporate goals. And I think that kind of incentive program can be very valuable. The other space that we're really focused on is supply chain. We do have quite a bit of materials in our supply chain from the buildings and bridges and roads that we help our clients build. And so we have engineers looking at solutions like low carbon concrete, how do we source low carbon steel? And then we have a very active sustainable procurement program that is working with our suppliers on collecting information about their emissions to make our scope 3 emissions profile more precise, as well as talking to them about what options we have to reduce their emissions, either through buying other products, alternative low carbon products, or through collaborating on, energy efficiency programs. So I think, services is a really tough space because you essentially, quote, don't control a large portion of your emissions, which means we have to work together. And that means, strengthening those relationships within your value chain to influence others to make different decisions.
Thank you. Question from Ion. How do you think tensions around Scope 3 emissions can be resolved? i.e., for many businesses, Scope 3 is the hotspot, but it can be difficult to get buy-in when the emissions are seen as somebody else's responsibility.
That's such a good question, and I'm glad to see upvotes on it because I think this is a really important topic. We have gotten to a point where working on climate in the corporate sector is no longer optional, in my opinion. Science is very clear. about what we need to do. And the planet does not care who is making the emissions, right? We need them to go down. And I think every business has a role to play in that, whether you directly control the emissions or not. And I think there's a few things that can help with these types of conversation. One is what your peers are doing. All of my clients are very, very concerned with what their peers are doing. They want to know, oftentimes they want to make sure that they're, keeping up. Maybe they don't want to be out in front, but they definitely don't want to be falling behind. So keeping tabs on what your peers are doing in this space and saying is really important. And then I think regulations can start to be our friend in this manner. I think how the regulations are treating Scope 3 is still evolving. In the US, for example, we had the Securities and Exchange Commission climate change disclosure rule, which originally included Scope 3 disclosure, and then they kind of pulled that back a little bit and weakened the requirements in a way. And so I think, as people who are not typically working on climate are learning about Scope 3 emissions and how difficult they are to address because they are outside of your control in most cases, I think it does become a big discussion, but it's something that we need to figure out how to solve, right? Because the emissions are from the supply chain for most companies, or for a large portion of companies, and we all need to come together to do that. And so I think that's, for me, why I'm excited to see various industry coalitions that are coming together to jointly influence suppliers, and also jointly fund supplier programs as well. So not a very satisfactory answer because it's really hard. But I think you can show where we're headed and you can show how collaboration can drive you forward. And those are good starting points.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Rebecca. How much are you incorporating nature and biodiversity impacts into your net zero conversations?
Love this question. So at Arcadis, we're in the early stages of doing that. We have a team. They are predominantly based in Belgium, who are ecologists, and they are experts at measuring biodiversity impacts. And so biodiversity is one of the typical criteria that we look at in our multi-criteria assessments, where we are looking at potential qualitative impacts. And so you saw that on the slide that I showed, the sort of red, yellow, green stoplight ratings for different topics. We do include biodiversity in our ratings. And the conversations that we're having with clients right now are really around, most clients are in the early stages of understanding what are our biodiversity impacts, and just starting to think about what do we do about them. And so I think there's going to be a lot more in this space of aligning decarbonization plans with biodiversity initiatives. And I think a good example of this would be in a data center space where they use a lot of cooling. Some data centers are located in extremely water stressed environments. An example of this is in the US, the Southwest. Arizona, for example, has a lot of data centers, which is partially because they had land and power available. What they don't have is water. And water-cooled systems are very, very efficient, but they use a lot of water in an already water-stressed area. And so can we come together between biodiversity and climate change and work on a solution that will benefit both biodiversity and the company's decarbonization plan? So I would say those conversations are still in the very earliest stages, and only our most mature clients are really thinking about them. But I do think that there's a lot of connections to be made, and that this is going to be a big area of growth for companies in the future, that they'll really start looking at this more.
Thank you. We've got a question from Rebecca. How do you make the business case for implementing net zero projects, especially when the costs are high and payback very long?
That's a great question. I think first you need to get your organization to understand that when we have a net zero target, we are not deciding which projects to do because they have a quote good ROI. They might have a positive return on investment. It's just, to your point, over a much longer time frame. And so it involves kind of flipping the script with executives and decision makers within the company that, hey, ROI is not the only reason to do a project. And so I think firstly, using the marginal abatement cost, which is the net present value divided by the carbon reduction opportunity of the project can really help show those long-term benefits. And when you think about it, most companies' net zero targets are after 2030. They're more than 6 years from now. And so a project you do today that doesn't pay back for 8 years, if your net zero target is until 2040, that project actually makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense if your company is usually, choosing projects that start having positive returns in year 2. But I think we have to get them to kind of expand their view of like an appropriate time horizon for a project and say, hey, look, these are the projects that we need to get to 2040. And if we're looking on that time horizon, then it's okay to not have a 2-year payback. And I think also showing the different projects that you've selected in terms of a profit and loss statement can really drive that home, because you will see, big investments kind of in the beginning. And then once you've achieved those investments continue to reap benefits for 10, 15 years. And so I think it's really all about extending that time scale. And that's only fair, right? If our target is 2040 or 2050, why would we only be considering projects in the next 2 years? So it takes work. It takes a lot of engagement and careful engagement. Again, what are your peers doing? What are the regulations telling you that you have to say? Really telling that story and showing executives that there's another way to make project decisions.
Thank you, Keely. A question from Zachary. Are there specific categories where you see companies focusing their efforts for quicker wins rather than solely targeting the largest emission sources? What are you seeing are the easiest Scope 3 categories for project implementation, and why might this be the case?
I think Arcadis is a great example of that. We have very large supply chain emissions. We also have decently large travel emissions. It's not our largest, but we are putting a lot of effort into travel emissions because 1, it's something we can control, and 2, it's an opportunity to engage employees across the business. Many, many employees at Arcadis, there are 37,000 of us, travel at least once a year. And so it's a great engagement point to get people thinking about climate. And I think that's a good example of sort of a quick win, if you will. And it may not be the biggest of our Scope 3 categories, but it is something we can have influence over. I will say, I don't want anyone only choosing the categories that are easy to work with, right? We need to be doing both. I do get the importance of showing quick wins and real reductions in categories you have more control over. So business travel is definitely one of those. I would say upstream or downstream leased assets could potentially be those, depending on the relationship you have with the landlord or the tenant. But those are kind of typically buildings. And then another one would be logistics. If you have, a large leased vehicle fleet that is in your upstream leased assets category, you can start switching those over to EVs and have a pretty quick impact. So those categories are also tend to be small. So I think, again, work on those quick wins, but at the same time, be doing that sort of long-term work on the bigger categories that you're really going to need to address.
Thank you. Another question from Rebecca. What are the top 3 actions you would suggest a business implements to reduce Scope 3 emissions?
That, unfortunately, is a question I cannot answer because it vastly depends what your Scope 3 emissions look like. I think Rebecca asked a question about being a professional services firm or consulting firm. Do I remember that correctly? So I think in the professional services space, definitely supply chain is a huge hotspot. And so identifying which suppliers are contributing most to your emissions and then sitting down with them and having a conversation about, here's our goals on climate. What are your goals on climate? How can we, work together to achieve these mutually beneficial ambitions? Supply chain is also an incredibly difficult category because your lack of control is significant and also very obvious. So yeah, I would say it's top 3 actions vastly depends on what your emissions profile actually looks like.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to move over to the chat function because I think there was a few questions in here as well. So we had SJ asking, saying we are a small civil engineering contractor. Is it best to use an external company to do an energy audit to give us a starting point of how we implement a net zero strategy?
I mean, best compared to what other options? I would say you may have people internally who could do an energy audit, in which case that would probably be the most efficient. I do think energy audits are important. I would personally not do an energy audit until I had a full scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, because energy audits can be quite time consuming and expensive. And so you only want to do them if you are confident that it's a big source of your emissions. And as a civil engineering firm, I would imagine that your buildings and real estate are not your biggest source of emissions. So I would want to understand your full emissions profile before saying yes to an energy audit.
Thank you. We have a question from O Fasul as well. So they're an ESG manager for an automotive testing organization, and they're interested in understanding more about how to translate the KPIs from a group carbon reduction target to operational and frontline colleagues, so that there's true empowerment and engagement from all different parts of the organization.
That is such a great question. And it's something that I have worked a lot on in my career, because you have to align your message to the audience, right? If they don't understand what you're trying to do, they can't help you. And so I think this is really important. And the way that I usually look at it is, so we have the carbon target, right? Well, what's driving those emissions? Is it electricity use? Is it fuel use? Is it process gases if you're a manufacturer? And then starting to look into your scope 3, where are their emissions coming from? And that will give you an idea of some of the different metrics that you can use. And so, one client I had a very significant real estate portfolio. That was the focus of their efforts that we were working on them with. And so we realized that energy intensity, total energy use divided by the square footage of a building, was a metric that their real estate teams were very used to. They have it on their quarterly business reviews, and it's a KPI that they already track. And so then basically what we did was we translated, okay, if this is the % reduction in carbon that you want, to do that, we know the future energy intensity of all your buildings, what it needs to be to achieve that reduction in carbon. And so we actually set country level energy intensity targets for 2 different categories of buildings, depending on their function. And so now the asset managers in those individual countries can say very confidently, okay, my building is outperforming the target, or we've got work to do. And then that allows them, or sort of helps them raise their hand and say, hey, my energy intensity for my building is off. What do I do about it? And that will kind of engage them in that conversation then of what reduction projects can you do. So I think the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and I know we didn't talk about how to calculate those in this call, because that's all, you could get a PhD in that topic. But I think having a solid scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions inventory is a really important first step, because it's going to help you translate your climate targets into the physical things that people see and understand every day.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much to everyone who left a question there, and big thanks to yourself, Keely, for taking the time to present to us today, and to everyone in the audience for participating. Again, we appreciate people's feedback to help us shape our future events. So please do let us know what topics you're interested in seeing in the future using the poll function. And today's slides will be emailed out shortly. So we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. And that's all from us for today. So thank you very much again.